So just yesterday, Ripple filed a motion with Judge Netburn that's absolutely putting the SEC in a bit of a hard place because it's forcing them to basically admit that they did not give Ripple any fair notice about whether or not XRP was a security. So I'm going to tell you what Ripple did in going after the SEC, which documents they're actually asking for, and why they're so damaging to the SEC's case. And not only that, the SEC also filed its own response today in support of its April 29th assertion that it has client attorney privilege, or that Bill Hinman had a client attorney privilege when he gave the famous Ethereum free pass speech. So in this video, we're going to review what they actually said, why they're in such a hard place, and why it's such good news for XRP, and why all these outside attorneys that are covering this case are going crazy with what the SEC is actually saying. I'm also going to be covering some news that just came out about Tether. Tether's new assurance opinion report just came out. I'm going to tell you how much they're actually backed by and why their reliance on US Treasury bonds is increasing. And so I'm going to ask you guys whether or not you think this is good for crypto. And finally, I'm going to be covering what one of the chairmen of the Cftc just said about Bitcoin. Because in my previous videos, I'd made it known that it was a good thing that if the CFTC would actually take a position to regulate cryptocurrencies, that it would be a good thing in general. Well, I'll tell you what one of the chairmen just said about Bitcoin and proof of work versus proof of stake. Hey everyone, my name is Randy. Welcome back to the Late Night Grind. And right now on this channel, we are talking about the Ripple versus the SEC case, but I'm also covering cryptocurrency news, investment markets, and personal finance. So if any or all these topics interest you, make sure you hit that subscribe button and join the Late Night Grind community. Also, if you do three things, I'd really appreciate it. Smash the thumbs up button, watch this video all the way to the end, and of course, check out my Patreon, link in the description below. All right, guys, let's jump into it. Okay, so first thing I want to talk about is the CFTC. Now, in a couple of videos ago, I talked about how the CFTC, how actually a bipartisan group put out a proposal for the CFTC to take control of regulation over a huge part of the crypto space. Well, recently, one of the chairmen of the CFTC came out and said that he would like to have updated ESG disclosures updated for anybody buying digital assets, and that would hopefully move Bitcoin from a proof of work model to a proof of stake model. In my opinion, that is a bad move because I don't agree with Bitcoin being moved from proof of work to proof of stake. It's not in a position to do so. And honestly, the ESG disclosures are not exactly in a good position. It's an extremely political tool that is being used. And if you're following other stories right now, it is being used against Elon Musk, and what some believe because he just came out and said he is going to vote Republican. So ESG disclosures against Bitcoin and attempting to pressure all the Bitcoin operators to essentially vote and push Bitcoin from proof of work to proof of stake, in my opinion, that is very bad for the crypto world. All right, so now let's talk about Tether, because earlier today, the assurance opinion report, which is basically a Tether's version of an audit, just came out, and in it they disclosed how much they're actually putting into the United States Treasury bills and how much it increased, as well as how much some of the commercial investments had decreased. So according to them, they're putting about 13% more of their Tether holdings into United States Treasury bills, or T-bills, which is a very interesting thing to do right now, considering what the dollar is doing. Albeit hitting some of the all-time highs, it seems like it's in a bit of a pullback, and of course going through inflationary issues just like the rest of the world. But nonetheless, Tether said it is now holding over $82 billion in reserves to back up the $82 billion worth of Tether. And in fact, the report said there is more liquidity out there in their reserve holdings than there are Tether tokens out there. So according to them, if there was a run on at Tether, well, they would be able to sell off their Tether as people requested, and there wouldn't be essentially a bank run. But nonetheless, they're still holding a lot of non-liquid assets, and that may be true to a point, but them holding a good amount of non-liquid assets, there's always going to be that risk. All right, so now let's get into the fun stuff. The Ripple versus the SEC case, and there's a few outside attorneys that are covering this that are basically shaking their heads, having their head spin, and saying that what the SEC is doing right now is absolutely crazy. So there's two issues we're going to cover. The first one being the one Ripple filed just yesterday. This was actually a motion to compel the SEC to turn over not some documents necessarily, but some answers to some of Ripple's questions. So back a few months ago, Ripple and the court ordered the SEC to meet with Ripple and determine what some of the RFAs were going to be for this case moving forward. A request for admission is basically an issue in which Ripple and the SEC both determine that they agree on that particular issue. It just helps the court and the judge move forward with things much faster. Well, the SEC was supposed to answer a bunch of questions that Ripple had regarding these requests for admission, meaning that the SEC agreed that these specific things had happened and that it can move forward in the case, with both the SEC and Ripple agreeing on certain issues. Well, I'm going to read a portion of what Ripple's motion to compel actually says, because this is one of the most powerful and damaging evidences against the SEC's case. So here we go. One of the first things they mention is inquiries about XRP received by the SEC's Office of Investor Education and FinHub. The court ordered the SEC to produce the OIEA and FinHub correspondence with market participants about XRP. The SEC's document production that followed included 57 unique inquiries submitted over a period of more than 29 months, asking whether the SEC had considered XRP to be a security. The SEC's responses to these inquiries show that as of late 2020, the OIEA was telling the public that it had not made a determination on whether XRP was a security, and that the SEC would not comment on whether it would make any such determination. In other words, as of late 2020, the SEC said, we haven't determined if XRP was a security, and we're not going to be telling you if we're going to be deciding on that. In light of this production, defendants sought admissions to confirm the undisputed facts that OIEA and FinHub received multiple inquiries asking the SEC's view of whether or not XRP was a security, and that the SEC did not state that XRP was a security. In response to any of these inquiries, the SEC refused to respond, objecting to each of the RFAs that the term market participants or XRP participants is vague and ambiguous, and claiming that the SEC lacks sufficient information to answer the RFAs. RFAs that go directly to communications to and from the SEC. So these are documents that exist in which the SEC was asked about XRP being a security, and they're refusing to answer these questions. They're refusing to, in fact, admit that these communications exist in the first place. So this is going to be really interesting to see what Judge Netburn decides. As of Jeremy Hogan points out about this, it looks like the judge should side with Ripple, but we'll have to see. And the second point that was actually a very interesting part of Ripple's motion to compel that they submitted was basically a request for an admission that on October 13th, Chris Larson had met with the SEC. Chris Larson, who is an executive of Ripple, met with the SEC and actually made a presentation to the SEC in which they attended. And the SEC refuses to admit anything relating to this meeting. Again, what Ripple is now asking the SEC to produce is putting the SEC in a very difficult position. All right, so now let's talk about what the SEC just filed one day after that, and that is a motion of support in reply to their new client attorney privilege claim. And this is the one that John Deaton, that attorney Jeremy Hogan, that attorney Fred Rispoli is all making their heads spin, and it's almost laughable. But as Jeremy Hogan pointed out, this is one of the most ridiculous things he's ever seen from the SEC, and history could be seeing it as ridiculous or genius. Fred Rispoli says that the SEC's comments are so ridiculous that they're actually making the XRP community's arguments for them. So the SEC, after arguing that Bill Hinman's speech was his personal opinion, later claimed that it was actually SEC guidance. And after that, they're now arguing that they can do both at the same time. It's all just to keep these Bill Hinman emails and conversations around this speech hidden. They're actually taking a line literally from one of Ripple's motions from a couple of months ago, talking about how the SEC can't have it both ways. The SEC literally used that line and said, Ripple can't have it both ways. They can't argue that we said that Bill Hinman's speech was an opinion or that it was official guidance when it was in fact both. And that is why we get to claim client attorney privilege. I'm telling you, you can't make this stuff up. It's like the court scene from Liar Liar. So now that the SEC can't decide whether or not Bill Hinman's speech was opinion, guidance, neither or both, in fact, it's now the SEC claiming that Ripple is the one with irresolvable contradictions. From an outsider's perspective, it does look ridiculous, but when you see so many outside attorneys that are covering this case, and what the SEC is attempting to argue is making their head spin, well, you know that Ripple is on the right track. So if you want to follow this story in particular, and any of the other stories that I cover on this channel, make sure you subscribe to the Late Night Grind community. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter. I will put a link in the description below. I retweet a lot of these stories and comment on them as well. So if you want to have a discussion with them about me on Twitter, you can do so there. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way to the end. I really appreciate all the thumbs up. And as always, I'll see you guys on the next video.